China's development is an opportunity for the world. China has not only benefited from economic globalization, but also contributed to it.
Globalization and free trade. Chinese President Xi Jinping cites these as the keys to global growth at his historic keynote address to the World Economic Forum. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. Global, that's the major theme of President Xi Jinping's speech to the World Economic Forum in Davos, the first by a Chinese leader. President Xi warned against protectionism, claimed the victories of globalization, and vowed to keep China's door open. To tell us more about President Xi's speech and the state visit to Switzerland, CGTN's Jack Barton joins us now from Davos. And Jack, this is the Chinese president's first state visit of 2017. What's the importance of Switzerland and the Davos World Economic Forum?
There's a convergence of reasons why President Xi Jinping would come here at the moment. One is, of course, the long and strong relationship that Switzerland and China have long had, Switzerland being one of the first countries to recognize the People's Republic of China, but also to recognize China as a market economy. One of the aims was to improve the free trade agreement the two countries signed a few years ago, and that was achieved with more trade, but particularly in the area of financial services. So an improvement in trade, and taking on that trade message, President Xi came here to the World Economic Forum, where, of course, he laid out a very strong case for more globalization, not less. Amid a very, you'd have to say, a nervous forum here this year, giving the pushback against globalization in so many other countries. But on that very same theme, he then headed to the United Nations, where he, with the new Secretary General in attendance, made it very clear that China is going to stand firmly behind international institutions. Again, when there is nervousness around the world, countries becoming more, at least a sentiment of isolationism on the rise.
And Jack, with this speech, President Xi outlined the vision for global growth, globalization and free trade. Now, this comes at a time when some countries are looking in the opposite direction. So is China emerging as even more of a leader in the global economy?
Well, as you mentioned, some countries looking in the other direction, and it all really depends where the United States is going to be going under the helmsmanship of Donald Trump. That's certainly the perspective from here at the forum. They're waiting to see whether he really does implement any of those firebrand policies or pledges during his campaigning to tear up trade agreements, implement tariffs, or whether he might temper that, with the reality of being a president, and in which case the U.S. would no doubt keep its leadership role. What China has very much done, though, amid all of these nerves, is it is acted as a stabilizing force. People were very receptive to President Xi's very robust defense of free trade, of globalization. You could say it acted like an anchor in the storm here at the World Economic Forum, calming many people. They were also very receptive to the idea of reforming globalization, of making it more equitable. President Xi talked about people needing to have a feeling they have a stake in growth, to be a part of that growth. And this is one area China has been talking about much more than many other countries, and it's certainly felt here. This is one area in particular that China could take a leadership role.
Thanks, Jack. That's CGTN's Jack Barton reporting from Davos, Switzerland. Joining us now from London, Keyu Jin is a tenured professor at the London School of Economics, focusing on China's economy. From Bangkok, Pepe Escobar is editor-at-large for Asia Times. From Davos in Switzerland, Philippe Monnier is an international business executive and board member of WayRay, a high-tech startup. And from New York, Robert Hormats is vice chairman of Kissinger Associates, an international consulting firm. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Keyu, let me start with you. We just heard from Chinese President Xi Jinping at the World Economic Forum. He mounted a vigorous defense of globalization and free trade. What did you make of what he said, and also the timing of what he said, coming just a few days before a new president takes over here in the United States?
Oh, I think he's trying to give a pretty strong message that China will do its utmost and also encourage the rest of the world to fight against protectionism, which is a potential and real threat to the global economy. And of course, China has been one of the benefactors of globalization, but what he is trying to send a message is that the whole world economy at the current stage, on the way to recovery from the Great Recession, should embrace globalization. And I think that it is very timely because the protectionism trends is obviously, the risk is mounting, especially with Trump's recent campaign rhetoric. These are real threats.
Robert, there have been very clear signals from the Trump transition team that the U.S. would put up protectionist barriers in its trade relations with China. Take a listen to this. There's been a very clear response from President Xi to what Donald Trump has been saying. Let's watch.
保护主义
Pursuing protectionism is just like locking oneself in a dark room. While wind and rain may be kept outside, so are light and air. No one will emerge as a winner in a trade war.
阳光
So, Robert, imposing tariffs and adopting protectionist measures may be popular with Donald Trump's political base, but do you think the U.S. can afford to withdraw behind protectionist barriers?
I don't think it can afford to withdraw behind protectionist barriers. I think the U.S. for 70 years has been a leader in expanding global trade and strengthening global institutions and demonstrating global leadership in the most constructive of ways for the most part. So for the United States to turn inward, I think, undermines American leadership, both economically as well as geopolitically and strategically, and it reduces the ability to exert leadership in Washington of changes in the global economy. I think this administration will certainly be much tougher in its rhetoric on trade and probably tougher on its negotiating stance, but to turn inward, I think, would be self-defeating to the United States and to American leadership around the world. And I commend President Xi for his leadership. When he went and gave the speech at Davos, it demonstrated that China and President Xi want to play a global leadership role on economic issues and have come up with a number of ideas to do that. And I think implementing those ideas will be a challenge in some areas because they're big ideas, they're important ideas. Implementation takes time, but I think the U.S. and China need to work together to make the global economy work in the interest of both countries and all countries. That's going to be an important goal over the next 4 years.
Right, and there certainly has been pushback from President Xi on this particular issue. Philippe, the World Economic Forum, which takes place in Davos in Switzerland, it's been described by some as the preeminent gathering of the world elites. But it was President Xi's first visit to the gathering, and in fact, it's the first address by a Chinese leader to a gathering of this kind. What is the significance of that, and why do you think President Xi used this particular forum to make China's case, well, not just China's case, but a case for the world as well?
I think that obviously the World Economic Forum is a very important forum. It gets a lot of media attention, so in a way it was a perfect location to make such a speech. In terms of timing, it is also good because it is just before the start of President Trump. And the fact of doing it in a neutral country like Switzerland, I think it also adds a little bit to the strength of the message.
Pepe, we've seen this wave of globalism, or rather populism across the world. Globalization having lost some of its luster. We see a lot of wealth inequality. In fact, as the president himself mentioned, the top 1% own a lot more than the bottom 99%. So how does a leader like President Xi convince the world that globalization has enormous benefits? I mean, we've seen those benefits in China already. Globalization is responsible, in part, for pulling millions of Chinese people out of poverty and making it one of the world economic powerhouses right now.
Absolutely, but here in Asia, all across Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia, globalization is still very popular. And what President Xi did in his speech, wide-ranging, talking about everything, NATO, Syria, inequality as well, was a very intelligent, sophisticated, and subtle pitch for China's view of globalization from now on. It's not going to be we win and a lot of people lose kind of globalization, which happened in many places, parts of Africa, parts of Latin America, and even in parts of Asia so far, and controlled by self-appointed managers of globalization. Some of them are actually in Davos as we speak. It's going to be something very close to the new Silk Roads once again. This was a very subtle pitch for how the new Silk Roads are going to conduct business in a more inclusive way, according to President Xi, and according to what China plans to implement. He didn't talk about the problems, of course, but it was a long-term pitch for a project, the only globalization project in the world as we speak, which is the new Silk Roads and its multiple ramifications and interpolations. And he also talked about the successor of the TPP, the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which plans to slash tariffs all over Asia. And always, he also didn't talk about the problems, how it's going to cope with Modi's Made in India, for instance. He wants globalization, but he doesn't want more Chinese products penetrating the Indian market. So it was very interesting because he left the most important part of his speech for the end, when he talked about the new Silk Roads, and then when he talked about RCEP, and also about the yuan as a stable currency, dismissing all this talk in the US that the yuan is overvalued. No. Not at all. It's not overvalued or undervalued. They wanted, the People's Bank of China want the yuan to be stable because stable currency means stable trade all over for China's and for China's partners.
Keyu, President Xi Jinping, in talking about globalization, in saying that it's been very beneficial for China and other countries as well, he did also make the point that it hasn't been fair, that there is wealth inequality. There were some very sobering words from him on where globalization has taken parts of the world right now. Let's take a listen to this.
Whether you like it or not, the global economy is the big ocean that you cannot escape from. Any attempt to cut off the flow of capital, technologies, products, industries and people between economies and channel the waters in the ocean back into isolated lakes and creeks is simply not possible.
So, if we look at what the president was saying there, how did globalization become the, I guess, proverbial bad guy in the world economy? What explains people's disillusionment with it?
I actually think there is a huge misconception about what is really the relationship between globalization and inequality. And I think it is important to clarify just very briefly here. From the perspective of the U.S., they often focus on the supply side, the employment, the manufacturing, the jobs that were lost. But they fail to, talk more about the consumer side, which is the demand side. Now, it turns out that the poorest American households are the ones who consume the most tradable goods, and in particular Chinese goods. And these goods have been much cheaper than, of course, the domestically produced products. So, in fact, China's import penetration into the U.S. has effectively reduced real income inequality because income has to be normalized by the prices, and because poor people and rich people have different consumer baskets. Funnily enough, globalization from the consumer side have reduced real income inequality in the U.S., and there have been quite a few profound studies on this. And of course, globalization has brought wealth and higher income to people in China. Now, it has not benefited certain groups. So there are wins and losses, but inequality is also driven by many other things like productivity and technological change. So the relationship between globalization and inequality is not as clear-cut as the politicians make it to be. But even more importantly, when Trump slaps on a tariff increase, who gets hurt the most? It's actually the poor households. Tariffs are like taxes, and in this case, it's actually regressive, which means that the poor households tend to suffer the most.
So, Robert, what Keyu Jin is telling us there is that Donald Trump is going to face a lot more challenges to simply slapping on tariffs and looking inward in his economic relations with China. He's talked about America first, but as Keyu says, the goods, the biggest consumers of these goods that China produce are lower-income Americans who get them at a cheap price. So he's talked about bringing back manufacturing jobs here, putting tariffs on Chinese imported goods. That's going to push prices up. How is he going to chart this course for America?
Well, I agree. When you put on high tariffs, it is a tax, and low-income people are big consumers of a lot of goods that are imported from China and indeed from other countries, and that would raise the price of the goods that they see on the shelves of Walmart or other stores. So it would raise costs for them. I think the big problem is, first of all, that globalization has been seen as the big problem for the overall economy. Partly that is because a certain group has benefited a great deal, and many people feel they're left behind because they are suffering from a lot of foreign competition, and therefore it has widened the income gap in the U.S. And the U.S. has not done as much to help people who feel they've been left behind, who feel that they've been disadvantaged. A lot of work is needed to help those people at the low end of the income spectrum, particularly in the manufacturing sector, who feel that they've been displaced or their wages have been threatened by globalization. So we need to do more in our own economy to help those people. The other is that global economy and globalization takes the blame for a lot of other things. The big disruptor in the American economy of jobs and holding down wages is technology. Technology has displaced a lot of jobs in this country. You don't hear much about that, but that is a much bigger source of these displacements that have been so politically charged in the last election. We've got to do a lot more to help people to adjust to new technologies and benefit from them, and adjust more to globalization. Not blame it on the rest of the world, but deal with our own internal problems. We need to deal with trade problems through trade negotiations, through constructive trade negotiations, but the fundamentals of inequality need to be dealt with by a series of domestic policies in our own country that we really haven't, quite frankly, done to the degree necessary.